Have you ever met someone and just known they would do something horrible one day? They have maybe those soulless dark eyes and hardened demeanor of some sort. There is just something about them that isn't right, even if they seem to act fairly normal and are possibly even kind of likable. Samuel Comstock was one of those people, and today we will cover his otherworldly life of darkness, from infancy to young gangster to mutineer, in part one of this two-part series, Evil for Evil's Sake, the Comstock Mutiny. My name is Jen, and this is Outcasts and Dissidents, New England's History of Misbehavior, where we talk about crazy true stories, real renegades, and rebellious countercultures of New England's past. Our story begins in Nantucket in the earliest years of the 1800s. At just 18 months old, Samuel's own grandfather had a prophecy about the baby. "I have just been struck with a kind of reverie about that child," he said. "I don't know why it should be so, but I feel a particular uneasiness with respect to his future destiny. As soon as he is old enough, he will form an acquaintance with the seafaring men of the island, and then I suppose he will want to go to sea, and his ambition will not permit him to be satisfied with the monotony of a long voyage. Thus, he may fall into bad habits and perhaps be guilty of some crime that will ruin him forever." Then, as an adolescent, Samuel's family's preacher had another prophecy about him. According to William, Samuel's brother and biographer, in his 1840 biography of Samuel, amongst the Quakers it is very common for an approved minister to ask liberty of the monthly meeting to pay a religious visit to the Quaker families belonging to their jurisdiction. Richard Mott, a celebrated preacher, visited our family in course. After sitting in silence the usual time, he arose and made some commonplace remarks, but then turned towards the spot where my brothers, Samuel and George, were seated. He expressed some concern for their future welfare. He said he felt an unusual degree of sympathy for them. He feared all was not right. He thought a speedy reformation was required, that they were in extreme danger, that an awful presentiment hung like a cloud above his mind while he addressed them. He then declared that they were utter strangers to him. He had never before seen or heard of them, but felt confident a terrible storm would one day burst on their heads, unless an immediate change for the better took place in their courses. The boys were mere children at that time, and no one present could have entertained the least suspicion of the tragical events in which they were subsequently to be concerned in the globe. But often did Samuel's mother remember the singular prognostic of the preacher when noting his violent and revengeful expressions." End quote. Even as a child, Samuel was badass. He had a dispute with his brother William about a hammer that ended in Samuel getting a split lip from the claw of the hammer. Not because William hit him with it, but, well, physics. The family called in the doctor to give him stitches, and according to William, he didn't even flinch. He was sent to a Quaker boarding school in New York called Nine Partners at 6 years old. Pretty quickly, he was called for disciplinary action by Switch. Welcome to the 19th century. He said, as a smarmy 6-year-old, friend Mark, it will be of no use. Father has already used up a whole poplar tree on me, but to no purpose. Cute. A year or so later, he returned home and decided he was a grown-ass man now and didn't need parenting. His father was gone to New York to prepare to move the family, and his mother was, well, out of her league with this one. By 9 years old, our little hoodlum was the leader of, in effect, a street gang of young boys called the Downtowners, who were at war with another gang, the Corlear Hookers. He made himself a shield and a sword of some sort of pseudo-chainmail for these battles. He would sneak out at night and come home in the wee hours with what William referred to as ghastly wounds on his arms and legs, the multiplied scars of which he carried with him to his grave. He was 9 years old. He was an avid fencer and outfitted their backyard as a military camp, complete with fortresses, trenches, and his friends as troops. They would hold cats and dogs on trial by court-martial and shoot them, in all due form and order, quoting William. with small brass and iron cannons. What, doesn't every kid have those to play with? He was fearless, reckless, and brazen. Despite being sent to at least half a dozen boarding schools, he was just too much of a hooligan. He was always armed with pistols and daggers, which he even slept with under his pillow. By 13 years old, his prophesied longing for the seafaring life started to germinate. Knowing the answer from dear old dad would be a resounding hell no, he attached himself to an Irishman from Harlem Heights, which might be actual Harlem, I'm not sure, to venture to Philadelphia to find a gig as a green hand or newbie mariner. His mother fretted all night, and true alarm was raised when he was not home for breakfast. Knowing him, literally anything could have happened. Around noon that day, a Frenchman entered the father's counting house, saying a boy had been detained by the landlord at a public house in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Samuel reportedly attracted the notice of everyone in the hotel by his good looks and intelligence. Samuel tried to lie, but ended up coming clean that he was just a runaway. Another Quaker, Thomas Freeborn, brought Samuel from New Jersey home to New York. When asked WTF, Samuel admitted to his folks that he sought to go to sea. Dad was like, fine, but gave full disclosure of the misery of the seafaring way of life. If you listen to the last episode, you will recall the wisest words ever spoken. Those who would go to sea for pleasure would go to hell for a pastime. To be fair, Samuel probably would have enjoyed hell as a pastime. William once tried to convince him that to burn in hell was contrary to God's loving kindness, but Samuel responded, "Do not argue me out of a belief in hell. I tell you there is such a place, but that is not going to frighten me. If I go there, as I likely shall, I will kick and squall and bear it as well as I can, but you can't persuade me that there is no such place." Apparently, he was just a boy spending his life in preparation for an eternity in the fires of hell. Dark and bloody was the thoughts of his soul, William recalled, and his smile was like a sunbeam playing on a tomb. The day after the little delinquent was returned home, old Dad hooked up Samuel with Hicks, Jenkins, and Co., and got him a gig on a trade vessel bound for Liverpool, England. The ship, named Edward, was commanded by Josiah Macy, who, despite the Edward's owner's apprehensions about young Samuel making the transatlantic voyage, admitted him on board. 4 months later, Samuel returned home. As William says, he was a changed boy with a taste for decadence and luxury. Instead of resuming the Quaker habit, says William, he now attired himself in fashionable dress, which sealed his damnation in the eyes of the Friends Society. They turned up the whites of their eyes when they met him in the streets and buttoned their coats to the chin to keep out the contamination of his presence, while the little Quaker lads nestled to the sides of their parents as if they had seen a wolf. To support his hunger for wealth, he just clandestinely pinch off of dear old Dad's stores, copper spikes, wine, whatever he could get his sticky little fingers on. Surely Dad knew, but no account of this is made. Although one time William caught him assiduously engaged over the bunghole of one of the casks with a funnel of some sort. Instead of being like, oh shit, when Samuel saw that he had been busted by William, he simply enlisted him as the lamp holder, and William was like, sure thing, homie, and thus became an accomplice. And then Samuel went to move one of the casks, and two of the chims, which is the fancy name for the edge of the cask, slammed together with his hand in between. Blood was gushing crimson, and William was 100% sure that it was severed, which it wasn't. So he ran out to get Samuel's friends he'd initially seen suspiciously out in front of the store to get them to help. When Samuel saw the guys, he grabbed the bottle he was trying to fill and chugged the entire damn thing and shouted they would not take advantage of his situation to deprive him of his plunder. Reasonable kid. And now, a quick word from our sponsor, Reship. We've all done it, tried to buy something online only to find they won't ship to the U.S. As someone with a loved one who buys a lot of computer parts from overseas, I was so happy to find Reship. because you just have your order shipped to them at one of their international offices. The vendor will ship to, and they will repackage your order and ship it to you totally legit. Click the link in the description to learn more. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming. His next trip to sea was on John Jacob Astor and Sons' 500-ton ship, the Beaver, to Canton, China via the Pacific. As a note, tonnage in a ship is cargo capacity, not vessel weight, so that ship did not weigh 500 tons. They disembarked in June of 1817, and due to some royalist versus patriot pissing contests, the ship was taken by privateers. The crew was locked up in a Chilean-Spanish prison, and Samuel was pissed, mostly at the Spaniards that had slighted them. Several times during his time in captivity, he almost got himself killed for spouting off. They did, nonetheless, apparently allow the prisoners to roam free about town. I don't know. So Samuel would basically just terrorize and victimize the community and return to the prison to be stoned by the angry guards. Rinse and repeat. After 5 months, the George, a Nantucket whale ship, pulled up into, I'm going to butcher this, please God forgive me, Talcahuano, and Samuel, under the influence of the Beaver's chief mate, got on board and was taken back to New England. Instead of being grateful, Samuel found an angry contempt for whalers. According to William, the shocking ignorance and gross vulgarity of the George's crew was a theme on which he dwelt often with uncontrollable disgust. It may be a question for how far an intelligent person is warranted in finding fault with the coarseness or ignorance of humble laborers who are honestly toiling in their avocations and make no pretensions to anything higher. I feel like maybe humility in that circumstance requires compassion that Samuel just was not capable of. Salt in the wound, when Samuel got back to Nantucket, he learned that his mother had died while he was gone, leaving her 8 children motherless. She was only 35. Regardless, Samuel fell in love with a girl shortly thereafter, and then she died, it seems, from probably scarlet fever. As William says, the glow of her cheeks gave way to the hectic flush. The dude couldn't catch a break and found carnal respite in local brothels. When he inevitably got another hankering for a voyage, his father, despite Samuel's open loathing of whalers, insisted that it be on a whale ship this time, since they spend most of the time at sea. They were also gone for years at a time. I also suspect that the ability to work through the ranks on a whale ship had an influence in that decision too. Samuel, surprisingly, agreed. He signed up with Captain Chabal Chase, who was enlisting men for a voyage on the Foster to the Pacific whaling ground out of Nantucket. The Foster set sail from Nantucket in the summer of 1819. And I may as well mention that just before this, Samuel was making fireworks and a spark dropped into the magazine and blew up in his face, severely injuring his face and neck and hands. Again, he took surgery stoically and went on with his life, making the voyage anyhow. On board the Foster, his delusions and life ambitions started to sprout. He was seen often walking the decks talking to himself in the rain or shine. It would seem that his motivation for accepting employ on a whaler may have actually been more of a means to a dark end than anyone realized. He later admitted that his life goal was to become the white king of savages, quote unquote, on a Pacific island, and that he would teach them the art of war, making them his personal pirate army. He intended to sail about and capture vessels to loot for booty as a pirate. He wanted to be, and I quote, the terror of the South Seas and acquire the immortality for which his soul so ardently burned, according to William. Why? Because he was depraved, that's why. More on this to come quite a few times. Fortunately for the folks of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, the captain of the Foster refused to let Samuel off the ship. However, the Foster did stop at Valparaiso, where the guys were allowed on land. And while it wasn't what Samuel was looking for, and he didn't become their pirate overlord, fortunately, what ensued was absolutely wild. Sorry, not sorry. That is going to be a patrons-only feature sometime because I can't even begin to cover it here. Oh, Samuel. Just shy of 3 years after leaving Nantucket, the Foster pulled up in Edgarstown to drop off their harvest of whale oil. His family noted that he had gotten a good deal more muscular and tanner on his voyage, but that he also had a had look about him. William said there was nothing left in his eyes of the frank and open expressions that once characterized them. There was a deep, subtle, and mysterious expression about them, which I thought very repulsive. Rude, William, but probably fair. For his next bout, Samuel really wanted to join the Patriot Navy. Not surprisingly, he launched into studying naval tactics and developing navigational expertise. Probably because of all of his injuries in his day, he already knew triage pretty well, but he tried to hone in on medical skills as well. All in all, his blossoming skills had him primed for life in the Navy, and he had dear old Dad's support. All of that came crashing down around him when some miserable Quaker bigots, as William called them, confronted their father and told him no way, no how should Samuel be allowed to join the Navy. They remonstrated violently against this, whatever that means in true detail, since Quakers were anti-war, anti-violence, theoretically. To me, it would seem kind of contrary to their point. Dear old Dad was forced to renege on his support, and Samuel was told he would receive no clothing that he would be required to have or any other form of support. And, add insult to injury, he'd also have to find another career choice. Samuel was a man bedamned to find a life of labor, or rather, to live his true dream, unbeknownst to his father, of becoming a pirate king. Thusly, he agreed to go on another whale ship and do the dogged work, much to dear old Dad's delight. If Samuel were on his best behavior and came back from the hunt well achieved, Daddy-O would buy him his very own ship to command. Slightly terrifying, whatever. Whaling came with exceptional money after even just one voyage, especially if you were tied to the owners of the company like Samuel's family was. Off Samuel went, eager to get going on the globe. He returned to New York to get supplies, provisions, whatever he would need, and more of it than he should have needed, which is worthy of note here. He brought more clothes than he'd use, weapons and ammunition galore, a medicine chest, every variety of garden seeds. There was no greenhouse on the ship. A neighbor asked what he was doing with surgical instruments, according to William in an excerpt. He replied that he thought they might be needed. She asked him if he thought he would have the hardihood to cut off a man's leg. Yes, replied he, or his head either. Mrs. Plum told him she had heard young men talk before, that they were always fond of extravagant speeches, and she supposed that he was like the rest of them. She supposed wrong. Also in New York, his little brother George made a terrible decision. Remember the beginning of this whole story. He wanted to join Samuel on the globe. Great. When they left, a bird flew through the window of the father's house. The bird thrashed around and injured itself before flying out the window. It left bloody streaks along the length of the ceiling. A visitor, hearing the story from the father, said, "If thou wert inclined to superstition, thou would be likely to imagine that was some omen relating to thy two sons who are about to go to sea in the ship Globe." Conversely, though, the Globe's previous journeys, and only a few at that, as she was relatively new, had her on an esteemed reputation, both as a lucrative ship and a happy ship. Lucky, as some said. She was a record breaker both in volume and timeliness of her harvests. It was on the Globe that the first 2,000-barrel whaling voyage was commenced, and it took a fraction of the time of most hunts. Morale stayed high and success was abundant, bragging rights for life. It was an ideal opportunity for both boys. Whoever could have known that one ship could ever earn both such fame and such radical infamy? Captain Gardner, however, decided at short notice to take command of another ship instead of taking another voyage on the globe, which was probably the most fortunate decision that he ever made. This left Worth, the former mate, in charge at the recommendation of Captain Gardner. Captain Worth absolutely loved Samuel, and they were soon close friends. Samuel was even at Worth's wedding before they disembarked. It's truly bizarre. Samuel was just exactly one of those kids you hear about who commits some horrendous act of violence, and yet some people who knew them thought they were just the dandiest. Never could have imagined they'd do such a thing type scenario. Samuel did, in fact, exhibit all of the signs, though. Ladies and gents, just let Samuel be the living example of red flags. He said all of the creepy dark shit. He legit told person after person all of the horrible things he planned to do, and yet, time and time again, he edged closer to actually doing it. Sweet victory was soon to be his. Several times, furthermore, if you believe in such things as many people of the time did, there were all of the sublime warnings every inch of the way, too. It's always hard to know if old texts are 100% accurate, but accounts of this kind of foreboding seem to have happened a lot in this situation, or at the very least, are referenced a lot. Shortly before the Globe disembarked on her fateful voyage, Samuel and two other young men on a boat fell overboard out of ignorance and arrogance more than any truly dangerous situation. Non-compliance, I say. One of them drowned, and saving Samuel and the other kid was not easy. And then, on the 15th of December, 1822, the Globe set sail and a sudden storm just cropped up. Some of the rigging was damaged, at least partly because the crew was new to the Globe and unfamiliar with her particulars. Fortunately, she was an easy ship to steer and handle, and it was not worse. Captain Worth thought it was best to just turn back towards port instead of finding a new port, so they were home again for another 4 days, awaiting the repairs. In the Atlantic, the crew got just one whale, but that was enough to begrudge Samuel. Our hero's denunciations, as William called it, began here. William, by the way, frequently calls Samuel a hero throughout his book. So here's to hoping that that had a different implication 200 years ago, my friends, or just maybe some brotherly love to soften the blow. But yeah, Samuel's denunciations of the whaling business broke forth, begin quote, the crude oil always had a bad effect upon him, filling him with biles and inflaming his flesh. He now lamented that he had been prevented from going out on the Patriot frigate, declaring that his prospects were blighted and the best part of his existence consigned to waste aboard a cursed blubber hunter, as he called whale ships. Between whatever his adverse reaction was and his attitude problem, getting along with his crewmates was a challenge, or his crewmates getting along with him probably is more accurate. He was a pesterer and an aggressor. Nobody wanted to deal with him. He belittled the green lot and equally offended the rest. While in port, though, seldom, Samuel even reportedly harassed black crewmates with his cutlass and patronized everyone else readily as well. Good buddy Worth, though, still loved his tyrannical nature. This was more acceptable and an indicator of being management material in their world, terrible as it may be. They simply called it being Spitfire. Worth himself was passionate, violent, sometimes tyrannical, according to William, who follows this with an example. Worth was threatening to nail men to the deck for being too slow about their job. Cute. So while Worth saw himself in Samuel, Samuel silently, seethingly despised him for the very things he himself was guilty of. After a couple of miraculous healings done by Samuel, one on an old man and one on himself, the Globe rounded about Cape Horn in South America and ended up in Hawaii on May 1st, 1823. The water was too calm to scoot the ship, but the natives no less paddled out and offered sweet potatoes, fish, and other goods to the crew. Worth didn't allow the crew to hook up with any of the fine island ladies, but do we really think that would stop Samuel? Of course not. On the next morning, says William, when the captain was walking the deck, Lady Comstock made her appearance, emerging from the steerage with an air of great dignity, dressed in a new Scotch bonnet and rose blankets, which her gallant had presented her. The captain stared at this unexpected apparition, but perceiving whose protection she was under, made no remark. I fear to think how many bastard children across the world belong to Samuel Comstock. After a brief visit in Oahu, a whaler sanctuary, for about 20 hours, the Globe moved on to Japan, where with their new friends, the Palladium and the Pocahontas. There were 2 other whaling vessels that they sailed alongside throughout the Pacific. They spent 5 months off the shore of Japan, and they scored 550 barrels of oil before heading back to Oahu for provisions. Word among the crew was that their rations were being cut too short, and they were growing disgruntled, particularly with Worth's apathy about the situation. Samuel, during this time, shot off a letter to his father declaring, You will soon see the bloody flag hoisted on board the Globe." By Samuel's account, when any man complained to Captain Worth that he was suffering with hunger, he would tell him to eat iron hoops, and several times gag the complainant's mouth with pump bolts. It does not appear that our hero discounts these arbitrary proceedings, but on the contrary, did all he could to encourage them, anticipating, no doubt, effects favorable to his schemes. Back in Oahu, 6 of the crew deserted overnight. Samuel himself really wanted to get his vengeful little patoot onto an East Indiaman ship, also at port in Oahu. Instead of sneaking off in the dead of night like the others, he asked permission. Who knows why? Like, really, a ballsy and strong dude like him, who was invaluable with a harpoon at the head of a small ship taken out to hunt sighted whales, would ever be freely discharged to join the East India Company. The East India Company had virtually a monopoly on European maritime trade in spices, opium, slaves, and more. It was in operation from 1600 to 1858. They were frequently subject to attacks by pirates for their riches, but Samuel probably would have gladly joined the pirates should the event occur, and that was probably more of a selling point than a danger in his eyes. In fact, he changed the words to a shanty to say that if Worth made him sail any longer on the Globe, it would be at the expense of his life. Silas Payne, an unbecoming man from Sag Harbor, Englishman John Oliver, a tasteless friend of Samuel's from that one time in Valparaiso, Anthony Hansen from Barnstable, Mass., William Humphreys, a black man, made the steward, Thomas Lilliston from Virginia, and a native man were all recruited to take the place of the deserters. Little did they know. All of the circumstances were aligning for his mutiny to blossom. He felt he had grounds to go after not just Worth, but the mate too, since he had told on him for talking shit and abusing the pigs on board, and the third mate Fisher for beating him at wrestling, apparently, in front of some of the Globe's crew and some of the crew from another ship they met by happenstance for a volley at sea. Samuel should have known, though, that when he asked Fisher to fight, he would lose, since Fisher was about 5 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier. Wrestling was usually ship versus ship in these friendly encounters, but Samuel had a bone to pick and insisted. Fisher quickly bear-hugged Samuel and dropped him. He wandered off to the sound of laughter from the crews, and Samuel followed, demanding another go. Fisher dropped him again, immediately. Samuel was livid and humiliated, vowing to harm Fisher for the embarrassment he caused himself, picking a drunken fight with someone so much larger. Nonetheless, life goes on, at least for a time. The Globe had sufficient provisions to move on, so they set sail heading south. Not a whale was to be found even now, but it is debatable how much of an eye the crew was really keeping for such feeble faith and flowing frustrations after all of this fruitless time. Instead, they seemed to be plotting with Samuel, stoking the flames and testing the fires at every opportunity. Some of the crew were more amenable than others to conspiracy. Whether fear or sound ethics kept them straight, Samuel was figuring out who his friends were. William Lay, for one, was disturbed and horrified by Samuel's rhetoric, and while he tried to alert the ship's authorities, Samuel and his cohorts made that impossible. The complicity of Silas Payne, John Oliver, William Humphreys, and Thomas Lilliston became the supportive crux of Samuel's plan. At this point, it's been 2 years, and still scarcely any whales were had. The Globe was headed for Fanning Island now, and only 3.5 degrees above the equator, and quite center of the abysmal Pacific. Even men who were not interested in joining Samuel's conspiracy were plotting desertion at Fanning Island. One morning, en route to the island, Captain Worth broke routine and decided to venture to the very front of the ship. He found a small issue and asked Joseph Thomas to take care of it. The man cocked an attitude and found himself punched not once but twice in the face by the hot-headed captain. It didn't end there. A minor altercation with Worth's mate Beadle led to Joseph being dragged back to the captain. Beadle had always taken too much gruff from the men and at last surely felt satisfied. The captain decided enough wasn't enough, and despite the morale issues, he upgraded from fists to a cat of 9 tails. The flogging was absolutely the last thing that this voyage needed, but here we are. 10 minutes of whipping with a rope tipped with tar, while Beadle held the poor dude by the neck against a post. In a remarkably unlikely turn of events, just shortly after our dude was let go from his punishment, and as he was being tended to by his enraged shipmates, Samuel calling for revenge, of course, someone shouts from the crow's nest, "Sails ho!" Another ship is on the horizon, and it's a whaler, no less. They jumped up, and the 2 captains, old buddies from Massachusetts, commiserate about the terrible whaling of late and decide to collaborate, heading together for an area that must surely hold plenty of whales. As before, some of the crew also crossed decks, Samuel being one. As the sun went down, he stood among the crew of the Lyra and said famously, "That sight reminds me of the saying of a famous Roman general on the eve of battle. How many that watch the sun go down will never see it rise again." Of course, this fell largely on deaf ears, despite Beadle having called him out as a problem, having the ear of the captain, a little passive-aggressively in front of all of these guys from the Lyra. How could they have known, though, that this was a foreboding and not a mere relic of his mind? Even a problem person is rarely taken at face value as a threat to life. At 8 p.m., Worth came on deck and discussed the plans he had made with Captain Joy of the Lyra. They were to sail on course until midnight, then shift and send a lantern above to help the Lyra's watchmen be sure to continue following them in the pure dark and thick, heavy saltwater mist that they made it almost impossible to see but a few yards at best. Samuel, as boat steerer, gave his young brother George the helm from 10 to midnight. All throughout the watch, George could hear unsettling, intense whispers in the waist. This was new, and given the day's events, and now more than 2 years' misgivings, it was bad. Very bad. Dread, fear, and unease rocked the poor kid at the wheel in the night. He couldn't leave his post, and did he really want to know? "Keep the ship at full." This voice spooked him. It was Samuel, who just appeared without a sound at his elbow, like the creepy butler in Mr. Deeds. "Why do you have all the head sails shaking?" And George didn't, and he knew Samuel knew that. What was the plot? Samuel put the helm of the ship so it was now 2 points against the wind, changing her direction subtly so as to lose the Lyra. Samuel disappeared again. More whispers in the night, growing more emphatic. Samuel came back to the helm several more times, threatening George not to make a sound. The more Samuel insisted that he be quiet, the more he wanted to be relieved of his post. He tried to shake the gourd rattle to be relieved. Samuel threatened his life. If he so much as moved the rattle, Samuel would appear stealthily and swiftly in the darkness, as if a phantom more than a man. "If you make the least bit of noise, I will send you to hell," snarled Samuel. George was actually largely unaware of the growing dissidence aboard the Globe, but intuitively he knew his brother was serious and didn't like the idea of transmigrating to such a warm climate, as William put it, and obeyed fearfully. A few minutes later, Samuel came up from the steerage, where the whaling instruments, more akin to weapons, were kept: knives, axes, and hooks. He set something heavy on the workbench on the deck. This was sickening to George. This was getting grimmer and grimmer, and that was all he knew. George realized it was silent. There was no more whispering, no more movement. Samuel had stopped vaporizing and materializing like a ghost. As suddenly as the silence set in, there was a heavy thunk in the cabin. With Silas Payne accompanying him with the boarding knife, Thomas Lilliston punking out at the last moment, William Humphreys as backup, and John Oliver keeping watch with bayonets at the door of the rest of the crew lest they be awakened, Samuel had nearly cut Captain Worth's skull in two with an axe. Worth groaned the sigh of death. Samuel struck again for good measure at the man's head who had been such a good friend to him, and leading up to the Globe's disembarkment, and as far as that split head knew, all along the voyage, too. Samuel saw it much differently. Payne attempted to take Beetle with the boarding knife, but these knives are massive, almost 7 feet between the blade and the handle, and not made for this like a cutlass would be. It bent upon slashing Beetle in the gut. Beetle was probably in shock and adrenaline was surging. He fought Samuel, taking him by the neck and trying to choke him, knocking the axe and lantern out of Samuel's hands. Payne was a shitty sidekick, and instead of doing anything to Beetle, he just fumbled around for the axe and handed it back to Samuel, who was having the life choked out of him by someone who is rightfully losing both their mind and their soul. Somehow, evil luck I suppose, Samuel manages to crack Beetle in the temple with the axe, smashing his skull. Beetle is now slashed through the gut and his skull is shattered, and he is in the utmost agony, but he's still alive. Samuel stands over him as he suffers on the floor, and John Oliver slashed awkwardly at him with a broken boarding knife, more for fun than for effectiveness. Samuel swung the axe and nearly cut off Beetle's head with one aggravated and impatient whack. Smith heard the kerfuffle and came out to investigate. He walked into the cabin and sees an absolutely heinous crime scene: blood, brains, gore, probably innards everywhere. Comstock, in particular, was absolutely covered in blood and totally fine with all of it. Smith ran for his life, as Samuel had threatened his life too earlier that day. Samuel followed his way back up onto the deck, appearing before George. George described him, according to William, as horrific in the extreme. His face, arms, and breast were bloody, his eyes flaming with fury, and his shirt nearly torn from his back. George asked if he planned to hurt Smith. He did, of course. George played naive, but was evidently crying as Samuel asked, "What are you crying about?" George said he was afraid Samuel and his goons would hurt him, so Samuel assured him they would if he spoke like that. Very comforting. The rest of the crew was, of course, awakened by now, but hiding in futility in their respective bunks. Samuel loaded 2 muskets and fired one through the stateroom door, for some reason, where Lambert and Fisher were. I've always thought the best way to get into a room is to open the door, but what do I know? I'm certainly not one for dramatic effect like Samuel. Also, for those who don't know, most muskets take about 30 seconds and a whole rigmarole to reload, so it's best to shoot wisely and not at doors. He shouted through the door, asking if he hit anyone. Fisher replied, "Yeah, you shot me in the mouth." Funny, not funny. Lambert asked Samuel if he plans to kill them, which also seems like a foolish response to the situation. Samuel clearly wasn't fucking around, and Samuel sarcastically replied, "Oh no, I guess not." The goons enter the room, and Samuel launches himself in the bayonet at Lambert, who dodged, and Samuel hit the floor. Lambert went after him, and Fisher grabbed the bayonet, pointing it at Samuel's chest. Samuel gave him the good old "don't you dare," so unfortunately for many people, he didn't. And while he had the chance, just totally dropped the ball. Samuel jumped up and stabbed Lambert several times with the bayonet. Setting his sights finally on Fisher, remember how Fisher had humiliated him at wrestling, Samuel spoke more to him than any other. There is no hope for you. You recollect the scrape you got me into when in company with the Enterprise of Nantucket? Nonetheless, Fisher pled for his life. It is no use, Samuel retorted. You have got to die, and you may as well die like a man. If there is no hope, said Fisher, I will die like a man. He turned his back and said with conviction, I am ready. And Samuel shot him in the head, point blank, killing him quickly and most painlessly of them all. Samuel proceeded to dance around singing, I am a bloody man, I have the bloody hand, and I will be avenged. Creepy. As he continued to play with and stab the dying Lumbert. Meanwhile, where's Smith? He was in the forecastle with the other fellas, busy trying to come up with a plan to not die. They hide in the hold, head for the crow's nest. All plans seemed to simply delay the inevitable. Smith had to reckon with the reality that his time was short. He resolved that he may as well face the Reaper, just as Comstock was calling him. What a little terror that boy was. Come here, bitch, I'm after you. Samuel laid eyes on Smith and buckled onto him. His arms were soaked with the blood of men that they had spent the last 2 years with. Interestingly, Samuel was softer towards Smith and did not actually plan to kill him. As a quite religious, God-fearing man, however corrupt his heart, Samuel understood Smith as the chaplain of the ship to be somewhat sacred for doing God's work in such a godless clime. As William puts it, he had a superstitious awe of pious persons and likely feared displeasing God by killing him, whereas the others were mere chattel in his mind. He asks, you are going to be one of us, are you not? Smith answers, oh yeah, I'll do anything you want me to do. Perhaps he feared Samuel more than God. Samuel later explained to George that he believed that if he killed Smith like the rest, quote, God would have avenged his death, and that while Smith was with them, the Almighty would smile upon their enterprise for his sake. He certainly wasn't smiling on Samuel alone. With everyone Samuel planned to kill dead, they called everyone to make sail separate from the Lyra. Once that was underway, he delivered his first edict as the new self-appointed captain of the ship. He required complete subservience on threat of death. Any disputes were to be resolved pursuant with the ship's articles in a duel, as any reasonable person does. Although, by this logic, people probably would go to great extremes to get along peacefully. Just a thought, not a reality. Samuel's mandated articles, according to William, included that if any man were to see a sail and not report it immediately, he should be bound hand and foot and boiled in oil in the trypots. And secondly, if any man were to refuse to fight a ship, he should be put to death in the same manner. As a team building and bonding experience, everyone had to mutilate the corpse of Worth, like some kind of morbid, ceremonious, or symbolic ritual of allegiance. I'm telling you, poor George. Growing up with him, loving him, and having to watch this, as only a 15-year-old, is just terrible. A first-hand account available on Scribe.com, written by two of the survivors, Cyrus M. Hussey and William Lay, who were not much older than George. They say that, quote, the mutineers then threw the body of Captain Worth overboard after wantonly piercing his bowels with a boarding knife, which was driven with an axe until the point protruded from his throat. In Mr. Beadle, the mate, the lamp of life had not entirely gone out, but he was committed to the deep. Beadle was really still breathing, they say, which is horrific and shocking because his head was almost completely cut off. Alive or not, they threw him overboard too. Samuel then ordered them to bring Fisher and Lumbert's bodies up from below. They tied a rope around Fisher's neck and one around Lumbert's ankles, and they were dragged upon deck. Fun fact, Lumbert was also still alive after being repeatedly stabbed with a bayonet. As they went to toss him overboard, he grabbed onto something and begged Comstock to spare him, as he said he would. And people really do have a hard time with sarcasm, don't they? Samuel forced off his grip and he fell into the deep blue sea. Realizing he might be strong enough to still swim and was worried that he might catch the Lyra, Samuel almost sent a few men down to finish him off, but decided the risk that they would flee to the Lyra wasn't worth it. As an aside, my utmost fear is being adrift at sea. That's a hard note for me. What a miserable way to die, especially with the salt water flooding and burning, deep open stab wounds all over your torso. Just no. They let fate take its course with the corpses and the living, suffering Lumbert, and set about cleaning the cabin. With what? I wish I knew. I would also suggest a coat of paint, in my humble germophobic opinion. Humphreys also pillaged the captain's sea chest, but didn't ever find where his real treasure trove was. Surely he had more than they found. They also dumped all of the spermaceti and whale oil overboard, no longer considering themselves whalers, I suppose. With Smith, of course, as chaplain, Samuel mandated public worship and reading of prayers for the souls of the fallen, or should I say the slain. To say there was no lasting psychological effect on the crew would be wrong. Samuel, in pain, trusted no one, especially Oliver, and took turns with the night watch. Under Samuel's rule, the whole crew ate with the officers, interestingly, and were privy to their conversations. During these conversations, according to William, Payne and Oliver complained every morning that they had trouble with terrible, horrible dreams during the night, and that the murdered officers had appeared to them. Naturally, Samuel made mockery of these complaints. William goes on saying that Samuel told them that the captain had also appeared to him, and shook his gory locks and pointed at his bloody head. But, said Samuel, I told him to go away, and if he ever appeared again, I would kill him a second time. What's really interesting here is that although he talked a big game, paranoia and, dare I suggest, regret were culturing. On one incident, Samuel seemed kind of uneasy and discomforted, and when he caught George looking at him noticingly, he said, I suppose you think I regret what I've done, but you are mistaken. I should like to do the same job every morning before breakfast. There is also evident distrust among the main mutineers, Samuel, Payne, and Oliver, never mind the other poor dudes. You may have noticed that we haven't heard about Humphreys in a bit, so where's he at? Well, only 3 days after the mutiny, George had caught Humphreys loading a pistol. He obediently tattled to Samuel post-haste. Samuel approached Humphreys like WTF, catching him with the gun in hand. Humphreys danced around the question at first, but eventually gave in to saying that Smith and Kidder were plotting against Samuel. Reasonable, I guess, but not likely. Smith being the holiest man aboard. Further, Samuel was the only one on board who knew how to use the navigational equipment. Without him, they would never find their way out of the wide blue Pacific abyss, let alone back to New England. Nonetheless, Humphreys, Smith, and Kidder were summoned to trial with a jury of crewmates. Now, I've studied enough old-timey court cases to know that they're unjust and often pure malarkey. As it turns out, to no surprise, that they were told to rule against Humphreys. Payne, in particular, did not like Humphreys or want him around, and Oliver didn't have the pair to pipe up in defiance. It was a hostile environment, to say the least, particularly for the only black man on board in the 1820s. In his account, William goes so far as to advise any of his colored brethren who might read the book to not sail out of Nantucket or New Bedford. This might surprise anyone who believes New England to be an abolitionist haven, but you just need to follow this podcast for a bit longer and you'll see the truth. An African, according to William, is treated like a brute by the officers of their ships. Let me advise them to fly Nantucket as they would the Norway maelstrom. He says, to all who contemplate a whaling voyage, I would say avoid, if possible, Nantucket and New Bedford, although the latter place is not so exceptionable as the former. In fact, Samuel was said to have been deeply uncomfortable with having a black person in his entourage, and probably was looking for a reason to off him now that he was no longer of use in the mutiny. All through the night, Smith, Kidder, and Humphreys were put under the close watch of 6 crewmates armed with muskets. No bed for what might be their last night, only a hard wooden chest for a bench. Not surprisingly, it was the last night for Humphreys, who was hung from a boom. A swift death, merciful by Samuel's standards. But as the two survivors say, the blood of the innocent victims was scarcely washed from his hands, much less the guilty stain from his heart. He was allowed final words, but they were probably cut short. He was given 14 seconds to speak, but all he got out was, "When I was born, I did not think I was born to come to this." Then the crew rang the bell, and he came to that. The men looted his body for the watch and $16 he had stolen from Worth's trunk. With this, the murderers on the globe were accomplished. The first phase of Samuel's evil plan was complete, and thus we commence the first part of this two-part series, Evil for Evil's Sake, the Comstock Mutiny. You will find below an annotated bibliography of sources used for research in the making of this episode. So where do we even go from here? Just join me in a few weeks for part 2 to find out. If you are a fan of this episode, I would suggest that you go over to my Patreon page, Outcasts and Dissidents, and sign up as a patron. You will receive episodes released early and ad-free. And until next time, I will be wishing you fair winds, following seas, and better luck than the crew of the globe. Whoa, hold the phone. You mean to tell me that Outcasts and Dissidents is on Patreon? That's right, friends. I wasn't planning it when I recorded this episode at first, but I have decided that I am going to start a Patreon. I'm doing this so that I can ask my loyal followers and my biggest fans what they would like to see for new episodes, to offer ad-free content early before the rest of the world gets it, and probably a whole bunch of other really cool stuff soon to come. So hop on over there, and your support on Patreon will help me to be able to make more content more often and do much more in-depth research, paying for articles or whatever I have to do to make you happy and help you learn about New England's deepest, darkest history.